On April 10, 2018, I, James Carter, a 64-year-old man, still vividly remember that morning. I woke up at 5 a.m., as I always did, kneeling before the small cross hanging in the corner of the living room in my wooden house on the outskirts of Boise, Idaho. With the Bible in hand, I murmured familiar prayers, asking God to bless my family and the congregation I served. As an active member of Grace Community Evangelical Church, I had spent nearly my entire life in service to God, organizing gatherings, teaching Sunday Bible classes, and comforting those in need. My life revolved around the church, hymns, and an unshakable belief that God had a plan for each of us. I was born and raised in America in a traditional Protestant family. My parents were hardworking folks who lived through the Great Depression, and they instilled in me a steadfast faith. My wife, Linda, and our 2 children, Sarah and Michael, built a simple but meaningful life with me. I always believed God's light would guide us through any challenge. But I never imagined that the greatest trial of my life was looming just ahead. It started with a dull chest pain I tried to ignore. At my age, I chalked it up to getting older or maybe overexerting myself during the recent Easter services at church. But Linda wouldn't let it go. "James, you need to see a doctor," she insisted, her voice laced with worry. I reluctantly agreed, thinking it'd be a quick checkup. After a series of tests, the doctor looked at me with a grave expression and said, "Mr. Carter, you have stage 4 lung cancer." The world seemed to collapse around me. Lung cancer, a death sentence in my mind. But then I steadied myself. I told myself this was a test from God, like the trials he put Job through in the Bible. I resolved to face it with faith. Chemotherapy started soon after, bringing with it pain, nausea, and exhaustion. My body grew weaker with each session, but I refused to give in. I prayed constantly, clutching my Bible, whispering psalms as the medicine dripped into my veins. At night, when pain kept me awake, I turned to scripture, reading passages that reminded me of God's love and salvation. But I wasn't always strong. Some days I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, wondering why God was letting this happen to me. I'd lived my whole life for Him, why me? Doubts crept in, but I quickly pushed them aside, reminding myself that faith meant accepting God's will no matter how hard it got. Then one evening, after a particularly grueling chemo session, I came home exhausted. Sitting in my favorite armchair, I felt a sharp pain in my chest, intense, unlike anything before. My breathing grew short and rapid. I tried to call Linda, but my voice caught in my throat. My head spun, and then I collapsed, darkness swallowing me whole. When I opened my eyes, I wasn't in my body anymore. I hovered above, looking down at the chaos below. Linda was sobbing, hands covering her face, while neighbors rushed in to help. I saw paramedics place me on a stretcher, a man pressing hard on my chest to revive me. I wanted to shout, to tell them I was still here, but no sound came out. I was just an observer, invisible and powerless. The living room faded, replaced by a gentle light in the distance. It wasn't blinding but warm, inviting. I felt an odd pull, as if the light were calling me. As I drew closer, all pain and fear melted away. I heard my mother's voice singing Amazing Grace, the hymn she'd crooned to me as a child. Then my father's voice joined in, reciting Psalm 23, "The Lord is my shepherd." These weren't just memories. They were vivid, immediate, as if happening right then. The light expanded, and I saw flashes of my life. The small church back home where I first served, the Sunday school kids I taught, the times I held a sick person's hand and prayed with them. A deep peace washed over me, like I was standing at heaven's gate. Tears fell, not from pain, but from pure joy. But then, everything shifted. The light dimmed, a chill seeped into the air. The sweet hymns turned into eerie whispers. I looked around and found myself somewhere else entirely. Withered, blackened trees stretched their broken branches like they were grasping at something. The air was thick, reeking of decay. Moans rose up, growing louder, turning into anguished cries, men, women, children. They weren't just sounds, they pierced me, making me ache as if I shared their suffering. Amid the darkness, a throne emerged, towering and terrifying, carved with ancient patterns that seemed to writhe. On it sat a figure bound in heavy chains, head bowed low. When they looked up, I froze in horror. It was the Apostle Paul, the man I preached about countless times, author of the epistles that shaped my faith. His eyes were full of sorrow and regret. I couldn't believe it. Why was Paul here in this awful place? "No, it can't be," I whispered, my voice lost in the void. A deep voice boomed, strong and clear. "James, do you see? Do you understand?" I shouted, "No. I don't understand. Why is he here? Why am I here?" But there was no answer. Instead, the darkness swirled, showing me scenes from my life. Times I preached, times I comforted others, then moments I'd forgotten, times I doubted God, times I was angry when prayers went unanswered. The voice spoke again. You've always sought the truth, James, but do you truly know me? The question stabbed at my heart. I'd lived my whole life for God, but now I wondered, did I really know him? Was my faith truly solid or just what I'd been taught to believe? I fell to my knees, tears streaming, begging Paul for answers, but he only gazed at me with sad eyes. The darkness engulfed me, and the voice rang out one last time, the truth is before you. Do you have the courage to face it? When I awoke, I was in a hospital, machines beeping around me. A nurse said, "You're okay now, we almost lost you." But I wasn't the same. The question, who is God, haunted me endlessly. What I'd seen wasn't a dream, it was too real, too profound. I tried returning to my old routine, but everything felt different. Every Bible verse, every prayer made me pause and question. One day in the hospital's small chapel, I met David, an old friend who'd left evangelicalism for meditation and Eastern philosophy. He sat beside me, listening as I poured out my experience. He didn't judge, just said, maybe you need to open yourself to something beyond your old faith. He introduced me to the idea of inner stillness, of seeking truth beyond rigid doctrine. His words struck me, making me wonder if God was bigger than what I'd been taught. The dreams returned. Paul was no longer bound. He stood tall, telling me, find the truth. I decided to walk a new path, not abandoning God, but embracing broader truths. I started attending meditation sessions, reading about philosophy and spirituality, and found a new kind of peace. Then a miracle happened. My cancer faded away. The doctors couldn't explain it, but I knew it was a sign of healing from something greater. My family didn't understand. Sarah was furious, calling me a traitor to our faith. But I wasn't afraid. I'd found a God beyond the limits I'd once set. After my cancer vanished miraculously, I, James Carter, thought life might return to normal, or at least a new normal I could manage. But it wasn't that simple. Each morning, as the first light filtered through the windows of my Boise home, I opened my Bible as usual, but the familiar words now seemed to carry a different meaning. They were no longer firm assurances but doors to deeper questions. Who is God, really? Where does the truth I'm seeking lie? Linda noticed the change in me. One evening, as we sat by the fireplace, she took my hand and asked, James, are you still okay? You survived death, but sometimes it feels like you're not really here. I gave a weak smile, unsure how to respond. How could I explain that I'd seen Paul in chains, heard a voice that shook the foundation of my lifelong faith? How could I tell her I wasn't certain of what I'd once believed so fiercely? Sarah remained angry. One day, she visited, eyes red and voice trembling. You've betrayed everything you taught us, she said, choking on her words. You used to lead us to God. Now you're chasing vague meditation nonsense. Do you know what the church says about you? I tried to explain, but she wouldn't listen. She left, leaving me hollow. Michael, on the other hand, was quieter but curious. What are you looking for, Dad? He asked once. I could only say, I'm not sure, but I have to keep going. I spent more time with David, who'd introduced me to meditation. He wasn't evangelical nor tied to any religion, but he had a calm I envied. We met often at a small park near the Boise River, where he taught me to sit still, breathe deeply, and listen to the silence. At first, it felt strange. I was used to praying with words, seeking answers in scripture. But slowly, I realized silence could be a prayer too, a way to hear God without words. During one meditation, the old dreams returned, clearer than ever. Paul wasn't alone anymore. Beside him stood Moses, Elijah, and even the Virgin Mary. They said nothing, just watched me with deep eyes as if waiting for me to find my own answers. I woke up sweating, scribbling what I saw in a notebook. Were these visions God speaking to me, or just my troubled mind? I dug deeper. At the Boise Public Library, I borrowed books on religious history, philosophy, even theology from other faiths. I read about how ancient Jews saw God as one among many Canaanite deities. I found parallels between the Bible and Babylonian traditions, hints that the concept of God might have evolved over time. It unnerved me, not because it shook my faith, but because it opened a horizon far wider than I'd ever imagined. One afternoon, as I sat in a quiet library corner, a book fell from the shelf. No one else was nearby. I picked it up. The Road Less Traveled by M. Scott Peck. I took it home and devoured it. Peck wrote that truth isn't handed to us, it's something we fight to uncover, that real faith isn't certainty but the courage to face doubt. Those words lit up my soul. I shared this with David. I used to think God was an answer, I told him one windy afternoon. Now I see him as a question, one I have to live to explore. David smiled. That's what I've learned from meditation, he said. Truth isn't a destination, it's a journey. But the journey wasn't easy. Grace community grew distant. Some whispered I'd fallen from grace. Pastor Robert, once like a brother, called me to his office. "James," he said sternly, "you've been a beacon here. But this meditation, these outside books, it's confusing people. Can you stop?" I looked at him, heart heavy. "I can't, Robert," I replied. "This is the path God set for me." I left the church after that talk, not with bitterness, but with a strange freedom. I started hosting small gatherings at home for those curious about my journey. At first, it was just David, an elderly couple from the church, John and Margaret, and Emily, a young woman with dyed green hair who'd left religion behind. We sat in a circle, sharing thoughts, praying our own ways, sometimes just sitting in silence. I didn't preach, I listened, and in listening, I felt closer to God than ever. One night, the final dream came. Paul appeared, no longer chained or somber. He stood in a vast field, light radiating from him. "James," he said warmly, "you found your path. Don't fear it." I woke with tears, but my heart was full of peace. On February 23, 2019, nearly a year after I almost died, I sat writing this. Linda had accepted my new self, though she held to her traditional faith. Sarah was still distant, but Michael joined my gatherings, his eyes bright as we talked about faith's meaning. The cancer hadn't returned, and doctors called it a medical miracle. But I knew it wasn't just physical, it was a miracle of the soul. I wasn't the old James Carter anymore, the man with all the answers. I was a traveler, crossing boundaries between life and death, faith and doubt, the old me and the new. I didn't have all the answers, but I no longer feared the questions. Each day, I walked with gratitude, curiosity, and a belief that God, or whatever name he bore, was with me on this road. The spring of 2019 passed in a strange stillness for me, James Carter. The wooden house in Boise, once my fortress of faith, now felt like an open book with blank pages waiting to be filled. I was no longer the man who stood before Grace Community, preaching with the certainty of one who knew God's will. Instead, I was a seeker, a wanderer on a path with no clear end. But I wasn't alone, at least, not entirely. The small gatherings at my house became a cornerstone of my life. Every Wednesday night, we met in the living room, David with his calm smile, John and Margaret, the elderly couple from the old church, and Emily, the young woman with sharp questions and green hair. We didn't have a pastor or set sermons. Instead, we shared stories, doubts, moments when we felt close to or far from something greater. I started calling us the Seekers, not because we had answers, but because we asked questions together. Linda began as an observer. She still attended Grace Community on Sundays, singing hymns and praying the old way. But one night, as Emily spoke about feeling trapped by religious rules, Linda walked in with a tray of cookies and said, "I don't get everything you're doing, but I see it matters to James." From then on, she joined us, mostly listening quietly. It was a small step, but to me it was a glimmer of hope. Sarah remained a raw wound. She refused to talk to me, despite Linda's efforts to mediate. "She needs time," Linda said, but I felt the gap widen with each passing day. Michael, though, grew closer. One evening, he brought a book, Peace is Every Step by Thich Nhat Hanh, and said, "Dad, I think you'd like this." I read it, and its teachings on presence and living fully in each moment hit me like scripture once did. I began to see that truth wasn't confined to one book or faith, but in how we lived it. The journey wasn't all smooth. One morning in June, Pastor Robert called. "James," he said, his voice low and tense, "I hear you're holding meetings at home. Some in the church are worried. They think you're leading people astray." I sighed. "Robert, I'm not preaching against God. I'm just seeking him my way." He paused, then said, "I don't want to lose you, but if you keep this up, the church might officially cut ties." The call ended, leaving me with a mix of sadness and relief. I'd lost part of my past, but I was free from old expectations. Then the dreams returned stronger than ever. In one, I stood in a vast desert, sand scorching my feet. Paul appeared, not on a throne or field, but amid a sandstorm. He pointed into the distance, where a faint light flickered. "Go," he said firmly. "Don't stop." As I moved toward it, the storm intensified, obscuring everything. I heard cries not of pain, but of release. I woke, heart pounding, feeling an urgent pull. I had to go further, beyond my own limits. I decided to take a journey, not to escape, but to seek. I told Linda and the Seekers I'd go to the Sierra Nevada mountains in California, where I'd heard of a reclusive community living simply and reflecting on spirituality. Linda was worried but supportive. "Come back safe, James," she said, hugging me tightly. Michael offered to drive me, and I agreed. It was a chance to bond. The trip took 3 days. When we reached the Sierra Nevada, I found a cluster of cabins nestled among pine trees, no electricity, no internet, just nature and quiet. The community's leader, an elderly woman named Rachel with silver hair and bright eyes, greeted me. "We don't follow any one religion," she said. "We just live to listen." I stayed 2 weeks, joining outdoor meditations, working in the garden, and talking with others, a former Catholic priest, a physicist who'd lost faith, an artist fleeing her past. Each had a story, but we shared a purpose, seeking meaning. One night, under a starry sky, I sat alone by a creek, listening to the water. I closed my eyes, and for the first time in months I didn't dream of Paul or visions. Instead, I felt a presence, not a voice or light, but a deep sense of being held, loved. I wept, not from sadness, but from realizing that God, or whatever his name, didn't need me to understand everything. He just wanted me to be true to myself. Returning to Boise, I carried that peace. Michael noticed. "You look different, Dad," he said on the drive back. "Not just healthier, but lighter." I smiled. "Son, I've learned that seeking isn't about getting all the answers, it's about living with the questions." Sarah finally called one rainy July afternoon. "I don't get you, Dad," she said, still a bit angry, "but I don't want to lose you. Can I come to one of your meetings?" I nearly choked up. "You're always welcome, Sarah." That night she came, sitting by Linda, listening as Emily shared her story. Sarah didn't say much, but when she left, she hugged me, the first hug in months. On August 23, 2019, I sat writing this, looking out at the golden wheat field behind our house. The seekers had grown to nearly 20, drawn by my story and our honesty. The cancer stayed gone, and I no longer feared for my health. What mattered was living each day with gratitude, openness, and a faith that truth wasn't a destination, but a path stretching endlessly ahead.